You're listening to That Music Podcast with Bryson Tarvin, the curriculum designer and educational consultant behind That Music Teacher and the Elementary Music Summit. Each week, Bryson and his guests will dive into the reality of being an elementary music teacher and how music can truly be transformative in the lives of the students you serve. Show notes and resources mentioned in this episode can be found at thatmusicteacher.com.
Welcome back to That Music Podcast. Today, we are going to talk about the appropriateness of different songs that you might do a movement song to. And there's different ways that we can take the word, appropriate. And first of all, I want to say that this is going to be, a lot of this will be very vague. Not necessarily vague, but it's going to be very specific to you and your teaching situation, your student population, your community understanding, your community connection, all these different things. But I think it's important for us to at least start this conversation because I think there's a few different ways that, that when we decide, all right, we're going to use this song to do a movement. I think there's a few questions we need to ask, or at least, areas that we need to think about to make sure that we are selecting the appropriate repertoire. Because what's wonderful about being a teacher is we get to choose what we include. What's awful about that is when we are choosing to include something, I think Anne Molesky said this, when we're choosing to include something, we're actually choosing to exclude everything else. So it's a big task we have to make sure that we're including things that are worth including. So let's talk about some of the different types of appropriateness if we're doing some sort of movement activity. And when I say movement activity, could be a dance, could be using scarves or creative movement, anything like that. Any sort of activity that involves movement that you're going to be having a song to. And the first thing that I think you need to be aware of is developmental appropriateness. So if you're using a pop song or some sort of more modern song, being aware of the language that may or may not be in the song, it could be important. Being aware of, even if they don't necessarily say a word, the context and the content of that. Keeping aware of also your student population and the understanding of what their music vernacular is, but also thinking about the movements themselves, right? Are the movements really, really, really simple and you're doing this with sixth grade and that, that's not going to work very well because it's going to turn into this, well, this is babyish. Or if we are doing a movement activity with kindergartners and we're doing this super structured choreographed routine, that might be a little bit too advanced. It might not be, but it might be just some things to ask and to kind of be understanding. And then the big one, this is the huge one that I see, and I've made this mistake so many times, is the length of the song. If you are going to do a movement activity of any real type, if you just being aware of the attention span that your students are going to have, and making sure that you're setting them up for success, right? If we're going to have this 7-minute movement activity with kindergartners and it's all high level the whole time, it's going to devolve into chaos 3 minutes in. So making sure that the length of the song is appropriate, within the piece, are there times where we can bring the energy down that can kind of give us a little bit more wiggle room of how long we can use it, but just being aware of that. So making sure that we're being aware of the types of movements that are in the activity, making sure that there are, it's not too babyish or too complex. And then being aware of the actual music that we're using can be really helpful as well. This doesn't need to happen all the time, but I think whenever possible, if there is singing going on in this movement activity, our students should be doing the singing. And I think this is one of those things where we can get into kind of some of the troubles we saw in, the developmental appropriateness we talked about earlier, but making sure not only is it, of an appropriate vocal range, just not super, super large of a range for, younger students, but also that we are aware of the content and things like that. But I also think we really want to give them an opportunity to hear something that they might not necessarily normally hear, right? So mix it up. Don't just do the same types of music every single time. Give them an opportunity to hear something different and to try to see things and experience music through movement in a little bit of a different context. Another consideration that I think we don't talk about enough is physical safety. And this might sound a little bit dramatic, but there are some games, I was I was incredibly blessed when I was in the classroom because I had massive classrooms with very little furniture in them. I was basically had these big empty rooms. So movement activities for me were really simple because there wasn't really anything to run into and we had plenty of room. Now, if that is not the case for you, and which was, when we started teaching during COVID, where we were all in different spaces all the time, I had to kind of adjust some of my teaching here. Being aware of the types of games and activities and movement activities that you're having in your classroom, because we want to make sure that we're not going against the realistic stuff of the space that we're in. For example, when I was doing my junior placement, I was observing a teacher. This is an undergrad. I was observing a teacher. She had she also had a massive room. It was great. A lot of room for movement. And then when I went to do student teaching, I was in a classroom that was considerably smaller. And I tried to teach the same kind of activity. And there was just not enough room. It was not safe. There may have been a student that got stitches, because they fell and they hit their head on a cabinet because there was just not enough space. That was one of the biggest learning experiences in my life, I have to say, of just understanding that the space that you teach in, although we don't necessarily have the control over it, we do have a control over what we do in that classroom or how we do it or how we modify it. So sometimes you might have to modify an activity from the quote unquote, the real way, or something like that to make it a little bit more safe, or maybe only have half of the students do it at one time so that there's more room. So just be aware of that. Be aware of tripping hazards, be aware of, what is going around the room. Are there any things that are kind of jutting out? Are there TVs that are hanging down from the ceiling that could become an issue? Whatever, just to be aware of. For me in my classroom is, whenever we would do parachute, again, I was also lucky because I had a massively tall room. But we used the parachute, it was a really big parachute. It used to be in the gym. I inherited it because it was broken. If we were to go up and down with the parachute, there was a very small but non-zero chance that we would hit the sprinkler on the ceiling. And I did not want to find out what happened if we hit a sprinkler with a parachute. So in my classroom, we never went up and down, all the way up and down. We might go really fast, on the floor, but we're not going to do the big bubble or anything like that because, again, I don't want to know what happens when you hit a fire sprinkler with a parachute. So just being aware of the space you're in, and you might have to adapt it, and that's okay. And I think the biggest thing that we need to ask ourselves, especially if we are kind of in the realm of folk dances and things like that, is this culturally appropriate? Are we the big one is, if we're saying something is from this culture, is it really? And are we allowed to share it? There are some cultures that sharing music is a very sacred thing that can only be done within that community. So being aware of that, being aware of cultural appropriation. There are some things that are out in the world that say they're from this culture, or this is this traditional dance from wherever, but it's not. It kind of ended up in a textbook. It was like composed and just kind of created and ended up in a textbook, and it just kept, this game of telephone, where it kind of turned into this thing. So just being aware of that as well, and making sure that we're being appropriate when we're choosing the repertoire, when we're choosing the song, the dance, the activity, whatever, making sure that we are keeping things as accurate and authentic as we can. And sometimes you'll do something for years and then realize that, that this isn't what I thought it was. And that brings us back to, as we talked about before, when you know better, do better, and kind of go from there. I hope you enjoyed this short but sweet episode of That Music Podcast. If you have not left us a review on iTunes, YouTube, wherever you are listening or watching, it would mean the world to us if you were to go in and leave us a review. Let us know what you're liking, what you want more of, what do you want less of. That really helps us not only just figure out what you're vibing with, but also helps us get in front of new teachers to get them this kind of bite-sized PD that they need. With that being said, thank you so much for joining us. In case nobody has told you lately, thank you so much for making a difference in the lives of the students that you teach.